Welcome to episode 365, where I'm speaking with Dr. Avanti Kumar-Singh about longevity. We talk about the view of aging in the West, along with the mechanisms of aging. And Dr. Avanti shares the longevity formula to help us live better and longer, along with 3 tips that you can implement today to support your longevity. So please stay tuned. Hi there, I'm your host Colette, and on this podcast I will be sharing the teachings of Ayurveda, yoga, and holistic health practices. Now, if you're new to Ayurveda, I recommend checking out the first couple of episodes where I do an introduction to Ayurveda and the mind-body types. Thanks for listening, and now here's a new episode. Hello and welcome back to the Elements of Ayurveda podcast. Today I'm very happy to welcome Avanti Kumar-Singh, MD, who is an internationally recognized Ayurveda and integrative medicine practitioner, a certified yoga therapist, and a former ER doctor. Her approach brings together Western medicine with the ancient wisdom of Ayurveda from her South Asian lineage. Dr. Avanti is the former co-lead facilitator at Northwestern Medicine's Osher Center for Integrative Health, hosts the Healing Catalyst podcast, and offers courses on integrative medicine. She is a sought-after speaker and advisor in the wellness community, sharing her knowledge with Fortune 500 companies, top academic institutions, and leading industry and medical conferences. In this episode, we're going to be discussing Dr. Avanti's new book, The Longevity Formula. Dr. Avanti, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Colette. I'm so happy to be back with you again.
Yeah, it's lovely. I was just checking out. The last time we spoke was September 22. Time flies.
Mm-hmm. Yes. A lot has happened for me since then. So
Really? Well, you've been busy writing a book.
I have. I've also been on a breast cancer journey that happened in February of 2023. So yes,
wow.
A lot has happened.
I'm sorry to hear that. I didn't realize that. So that's been quite a shakeup in your life.
It has. And it was actually 4 months into writing this book that happened. So it's been an interesting journey. It really did shape a lot of what I wrote in my new book, The Longevity Formula. So it's been an interesting
Talk about making it an even deeper, writing process when you're dealing with this catastrophe in your own health.
Yes. It's, I think for so many of us that are in integrative medicine, especially if we live an Ayurvedic lifestyle, which I know, you and many of your listeners are very deep in Ayurveda. When you're hit with something like this, and you've been practicing this lifestyle, this way of living and being in the world for most of your life. I mean, I've grown up with Ayurveda since I was a child. My parents immigrated from India, so I'm first generation South Asian in the United States. You sort of are like, wait, what? I was really upset and angry. I was like, are you kidding? I've spent my life taking care of other people. This is my profession. I'm a physician. I practice Ayurveda, an Ayurvedic lifestyle, and this is what I get. And so it was really difficult to sort of come to terms with and understand sort of how it fit in to my work, my life, my dharma, why I'm here. Those are all the questions that I really spent a lot of time thinking about during that year of treatment. So and hopefully it comes out in the book too. Yeah.
Wow. It is amazing. But I can definitely understand your initial reaction of like, hey, wait now. Is this the cards I'm being dealt? Given my whole life, I've been aware and living Ayurvedic practices and helping others with that. I can imagine the initial shock and the emotions that surfaced.
Yeah, and I think what I really came to, which I think is the most important part of this journey for me, is that I realized that, we always talk about Ayurveda being preventative, which it is. It prevents a lot of things. But I think it's more than that. And that's what I came to realize, is that Ayurveda is protective of our health today, every day, not just way in the future, that preventative sort of, idea that people have of, it can be so esoteric and it can feel so far away for many people. But I think what I really learned in such a very personal way is that it's protective of your health. And the reason that I came to this is really that, I ended up doing a combination of treatment. I did all of the conventional Western medical treatment. And I also integrated, integrative medicine, acupuncture, nutrition, Ayurveda, of course, right into that healing for myself. So it was really an integrated approach. But what I'll tell you is that from the day that I was diagnosed on February 17th of 2023, shortly after we spoke,
wow.
until the last day of treatment, my last radiation treatment, which was on September 17th of 2023. That's exactly 7 months. And really, my treatment time was only 6 months, probably. But I had 8 rounds of very intensive chemotherapy, followed 4 weeks later by a bilateral mastectomy, followed 4 weeks later by 15 radiation treatments. Now, I say this because I want our listeners to really understand the protective nature of Ayurveda, because yes, I speak the language. I'm a physician. I can push things forward. I was able to get through the system a little faster. Absolutely. Did I call in a few favors? Absolutely, I did. Mm-hmm. And my healing team also would not have allowed me to continue with treatment without treatment delays if I couldn't handle it. And the reality is that between every chemotherapy treatment, I only had 2 weeks between that, about 10 days. And I would recover pretty quickly. It's like I bounced back faster. I had more resilience. And that's what I realized, is that Ayurveda has been protecting me because, the reality is, Colette, that we live in a very toxic world, right? Toxic in every way, politically, environmentally, in our food, in our water, the emotions that people have, the stress factors that we all have. We have so many toxins that we talk about in Ayurveda. And unless you're willing to isolate yourself completely and not go out and not be in contact with the world, you are going to be exposed to toxins. And so much of what we do in Ayurveda is to decrease that toxic load. What I realized is that by decreasing that toxic load and practicing so many Ayurvedic principles, practices, ways of being, I was protecting myself so that when I was faced with a very difficult diagnosis, I was able to deal with it more effectively. And so that was such a big, deep learning for me that I feel so compelled to share with people, especially all of us who are really, really deep in Ayurveda, to know that this is going to protect you. Mm-hmm. It really will.
Wow. Thank you for being so open and for sharing that. And I think your message is very profound and, a lived experience, right? That shook up your world, but you're coming out of it with this amazing message as well. Mm-hmm. And how are you feeling?
I'm doing today? Great. Honestly, it's been a year since I finished my treatment, and I'm probably about, I'd say 85-90% back to my normal, which is pretty good. So I'm feeling great.
Well, that's great to hear. And again, thank you for sharing that. And as you said, you were a few months into writing the book, The Longevity Formula. So your world was turned upside down during this time.
Yeah. And it's interesting because, I really, this project started almost 4 years ago when I was approached by a publisher to write this book. And I was thinking about longevity only because I was about to turn 50 and I was, sort of stepping into the next era of my life. And I was sort of really considering, what does that look like for me, with respect to my work, with respect to my health, the impact I want to have. the things that I want to experience, right? I had just sent off my younger child off to college. And so it was sort of like, okay, what's the next phase? And I started thinking about my elders, my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, who lived a very Ayurvedic lifestyle. He's been such an inspiration for me to really add this work into the practice that I do and how I help people. And I started thinking about my parents. I started thinking about my elders and how they were living well into their 70s, 80s, and 90s with such vibrancy, right? With good health. They are living independently, doing all of their things for themselves, right? At home, really have sharp minds and good cognition, right? Very connected to their families and their communities. And I started thinking, well, what's the difference here? Why is that happening for all these elders who are South Asian who have had Ayurveda as part of their life versus what we see in Western culture, right? The pictures of orthopedic shoes and dentures and, nursing homes and, surgeries and pills and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Why was there such a big difference, right? And that's sort of where I started thinking about longevity and the connection to Ayurveda. And I sort of started diving deep into the research of how does this all square? What is it that we have in Ayurveda that we've been doing for 5,000 years? And why does it work? And looking at the research and the studies and saying, oh, that's why it works. That's why it works. Oh, I see. That's why it works. And that's really what I try to present in this book, is to sort of bring those two things together, because I know the Western mind wants to know why.
Right,
and
exactly.
So this is the why from my perspective.
I have to say, I love that you wove your grandfather, Babaji, that you wove his story and that you went back to your childhood and your lineage and took all those stories and talked about his routine and how integral that was in his life and his health and well-being, and gave him such longevity. So that was a lovely part of the book because it was
Thank you.
Personal. I really enjoyed that.
Oh, thank you. I'm so glad.
Yeah, that was a fun part to read. So I'd love to start by setting the foundation and defining longevity. That would be great.
Yeah, of course. So, longevity is really this idea of living more years of our lives with health and vitality and vibrancy. It's different than lifespan. Lifespan is our chronological age, right? We get older each year, regardless of what we do to try and stop that process from happening. So this idea of anti-aging is a myth that we've all been sold. There is no such thing, right? And that aging is chronological, right? Longevity is more about health span, not lifespan. They're two different things, right? Western medicine is very, very good at extending our life in the sense of the years that we are living, right? We see that. But what is the quality of that life? That's where I feel that Western medicine is not so great. And that's why, these ancient healing systems, Ayurveda included, and probably most profoundly, allows us to live longer with more vitality. It increases our health span, our longevity. So that's really the very, very crucial difference. And when we're talking about longevity, we're talking about trying to get our health span to equal our lifespan, right? So that we're living all the years that we're alive, however chronologically aged we are, 79, 89, 99, 109, right? With vitality, with cognitive function, full function, living independently as much as we can, being involved in our communities and our families, right? That's what we're really talking about when we talk about longevity.
Yeah, great explanation there. It's really like the life in our years. Right.
Exactly. Yes.
Absolutely. And you mentioned this longevity versus anti-aging there, and the negative connotation of this anti-aging that we have in our society. We're all aging. It's natural. So can you talk a little bit about that? Like this negative effect of just this constant use of this anti-aging term?
Yeah, it's this term that we have in the West that, is sort of making it seem that aging is bad and that it's something we need to, quote, fight against. And in the East, there's such a different perspective of aging. It's seen as something graceful. It's seen as something important. And it's seen as wisdom, right? In Ayurveda, we actually refer to the Vata time of life, right? 50 plus as wisdomhood, right? We have childhood when we're young. We have adulthood in the middle. And this time is wisdomhood. And what a beautiful way to think about it. I don't think that in the West, that aging is synonymous with wisdomhood necessarily. It's more about decline, right? And so I think this is really trying to challenge that perspective that aging can be graceful. It can be beautiful. It can be really, really important for how we contribute to society and to our families, right? It's not this time that we sort of just, drift off into the sunset and sort of like wait for the inevitable, right?
Yeah.
I think that that's really where I go to. I don't know what you feel about that term.
100%. I agree. And, in the West, we have this view of aging as, the elderly become a burden and it's in the nursing home. And,
Right.
It's all this negative connotation about it. Whereas versus Ayurveda and these other ancient wisdoms, it's more about the wisdom and the wealth of wisdom that can be a benefit to younger generations. Exactly. Now, we do see more elder wisdom schools. I've seen a lot of this popping up on podcasts and of events happening where there's a more of a respect for elderhood and the wisdom. Have you seen that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that, from 17 years ago when I started doing this, integrating Ayurveda and, Western medicine to now, there has been a shift in everything. And I think, part of that is also, longevity is sort of a hot topic in the past few years in the West, right? And it's more about biohacking our ways to living to 125 and doing all these tests and doing all these, procedures. And it's very technology based, which, there's nothing wrong with that because, Western medicine is about technology, about moving forward. And that's really important. It's the reason that I was able to have the kind of treatment that I had. So I absolutely respect that. And also, that is not available to most people, right? Most people don't have access to these tests, to these, the technology, the wearable technology. They might have some things, but I don't know. Do they have some of these sophisticated types of technology that we're talking about, in a lot of the integrative medicine circles, in the biohacking circles? And so again, I think that the idea here was to really go back to what has worked for 5,000 years, right? And how can we integrate that into sort of the modern approach to aging and longevity, right? And how can that be something that we can add to maybe the wearable technology that we're using, and make it just as important, if not more important? Because I feel like we've kind of gotten away from that with the way longevity is being talked about.
Exactly. And, this ancient wisdom has stood the test of time.
Exactly.
We have these thousands of years of evidence that we don't have with this technology that's coming through. And I agree with you. There has to be a balance of the two.
Yeah, I often joke with my colleagues who will, challenge me on Ayurvedic practices or principles. And they'll say, well, Avanti, where's the proof? Show me the proof. And I just will say to them, 5,000 years of proof isn't enough for you. And I just laugh and they're like, oh, and mic drop. Exactly. And they're like, okay. But you know what I'm saying? I said, I know what you're saying. And also it stood the test of time.
Exactly. Right? Have you heard about the Elements of Ayurveda podcast community? Now, we know that being a part of a community is an important factor in our health and well-being. It gives us a sense of belonging and enables us to share and support each other on this journey. When I talk to clients, they tell me how hard it is to find others interested in Ayurveda in their local area. And as we make changes in our lives on our Ayurvedic journey, it's important to have a place to communicate with others on the same journey. This is why I set up the Elements of Ayurveda podcast community. It's a private space on my website away from social media where we can connect with like-minded people and support each other. For a small monthly fee, you will receive the following. You'll get early access to the weekly podcast episodes. There'll be regular Zoom calls with the community to discuss podcast episodes or Ayurvedic questions or share recipes and much more. There will be regular group challenges for motivation and accountability. For example, meditation challenges or maybe self-care challenges. And it's a private place to connect with others passionate about Ayurveda. So if you're interested in being part of the Elements of Ayurveda podcast community, just click on the link in the show notes or visit my website, elementshealingandwellbeing.com, and go to the events page where you'll find all the details on the podcast community. And I hope to connect with you there soon. And you talked about in your book that there's 9 well-established general mechanisms of physiological aging. I'd love for us to go through those in general so people can understand. That would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So, right now at the time of us, doing this interview and at the time of when I wrote the book, there are sort of generally in Western medicine, sort of 9 mechanisms of aging that are generally agreed upon. And, I'll go through them each. I can just talk about, I'll sort of briefly mention because there's a lot of science and I don't, we can go as deep as you want on any of those that you want. But the first is genetic or DNA damage, which is just damage to our genetic blueprint, right? DNA makes us us. The second mechanism is telomere shortening, which telomeres are the protection on the ends of our DNA. And as they shorten, as we age, that will actually our DNA loses protection and then it has more of a chance of becoming damaged. So telomere shortening is the second mechanism of aging. The third is epigenetic changes, which is really epigenetics is sort of the on-off switches of our genes. And in recent years, probably in the last 25 or 30 years, there's been more and more talk about epigenetics. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But epigenetic changes are really about how does our lifestyle, the environment, et cetera, all the things that we talk about in Ayurveda, how do those factors turn genes on and off to be expressed or to not be expressed? The fourth is protein damage, which is damage to, the proteins, which are the building blocks of us, and also of all the messengers, the chemical messengers that are going throughout our body to make sure everything is happening on time. So that protein can be damaged. The fifth is dysregulated nutrient sensing, which is really something that has been really, really in the media a lot because it has to do with food and how do we regulate our nourishment? How do we get what we need? How does food actually influence longevity switches being turned on and off? That's specifically what that's about. And there are 4 different nutrient sensing pathways. The sixth is mitochondrial dysfunction, which, mitochondria are the powerhouses of our cells. And so when we have dysfunction in the mitochondria, we don't have enough energy for biological processes, for cellular processes. And so that can contribute to physiological aging. The seventh is senescent cells, which is really these cells that should be removed, but they kind of hang around like zombies and they cause all kinds of havoc in our tissues. The eighth is stem cell exhaustion, which is stem cells, right, have the potential to become everything. And when we have stem cell exhaustion, we don't have that function anymore. And so we lose the ability to become anything. So the cell differentiation that we need is lost as we get older, physiologically. And then the ninth, which is the most important and is actually related to all of the other 8 mechanisms of aging is something that has been coined as inflammaging, which is this inflammation as we age that is caused by all of these other mechanisms. It's this low level chronic inflammation that is in our cells, in our tissues, in our organs, in our systems. And really it's less of the right kind of inflammation, because inflammation is protective, and more of the wrong kind, where it's chronic and it's actually hurtful to our systems, right? It's not protective. So those are the 9 mechanisms.
Thank you so much for
Of
going
course.
into those. And they are the ones that are generally recognized by Western medicine. And then in your book, you also talked about the Ayurvedic view that dhatu, or tissue depletion, is another one of the main mechanisms of aging according to Ayurveda. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah. And so, this is what the sort of aha that happened for me was that, in Ayurveda, what we're really trying to do is keep our tissues, those 7 dhatu layers, nourished. And the issue is in our tissues, right? As we get older, those tissues become depleted. Now, all of the Ayurvedic practices that we have are really to nourish those tissues, right? If we're talking about abhyanga, we're trying to nourish the outer skin to then go inside, remove toxins, and nourish every layer of the tissues. That's what we're trying to do. And so I started thinking, oh, well, that makes sense, because from a Western standpoint, and this is how I coined sort of this idea of the longevity formula, right? We have this cellular damage that's happening, and this damaged the cells that are accumulating in the tissues that then cause inflammation and depletion of the tissues. That's how I sort of connected the two together. And so we have these Western constructs for what's happening physiologically. But then if you step back into the Ayurvedic perspective, those mechanisms, those Western sort of physiological mechanisms, are causing depletion of the tissues. And so from my perspective, if we can continually nourish the tissues as we age, we will increase our longevity. We will support longevity. That's really sort of the overall sort of message of the book. And so the longevity formula is that if you can increase cellular repair and decrease inflammation, you then decrease the amount of accumulated damage, right? Cellular damage. And therefore you will be able to nourish the tissues. That's how it all connects.
Beautiful. Yeah. And it goes back to what you say, by nourishing the tissues, providing that protection that you talked about at the start. After going through those 9 or 10, including the tissue depletion mechanisms of aging, and we see in our society today, the huge stress we're under on many points, that, we're not doing so good. Right. In today's world, we may have great technology. Most of us are fortunate to have food at hand, have abundance of food and abundance of information. But what type of report card would you give us today in regards to our longevity?
Well, I mean, it's not a good one. I mean, I did a lot of research on this. As we age, right, we take more trips to the doctor, more trips to the emergency room. We have more prescription refills and more numbers of medications we're actually taking. We have more hospital stays, and we have more rehabilitation post-discharge from the hospital, or, after any kind of an injury. And, some of the statistics are alarming. 1 in 6 Americans has a chronic disease that's defined by the CDC as a condition that lasts 1 year or longer. Okay. And limits daily activity, that would provide daily living, so that's essential for daily living, or requires ongoing medical attention by physicians. And according to the National Council on Aging, 80% of adults over the age of 65 have at least one chronic disease, and 68% have 2 or more. So yeah, we're not doing well. right?
No.
Again, it comes back to this idea that, we're really good in Western medicine at helping us live longer, many more years. But what is the quality of life that we have?
Exactly. We're keeping people alive longer, but they're lacking vitality. And like you said, what quality of life do they have? It's a real predicament now, because yes, we have the medications and and technology to keep people alive, but is it worth it if they don't have vitality and they can't, be independent? And you put together the longevity formula, which is a 2-step method you have to help us live better and longer. So can you tell us about this longevity formula?
Yeah, as I sort of talked about earlier, this idea of longevity is really about nourishing the tissues. And the two parts of the formula is that if we can decrease the cellular damage, right? That's what we're trying to do so that we nourish the tissues. There's two ways we can do that. We can increase cellular repair and we can decrease inflammation. And many times those are working together, actually. And, in the book, I sort of go through all of these different practices that we can do that we have been doing in Ayurveda and how that actually directly affects either cellular repair or inflammation and leads to more nourishment of the tissues. And so I really try to connect those. But, maybe the way to talk about this, since we only have, so much time right now, is that, what I realized when I was writing this formula is that when I looked at all of the Ayurvedic practices, I saw 5 longevity switches, if you would say, right? We have these 9 mechanisms of aging from a Western perspective, and from an Eastern perspective, an Ayurvedic perspective, I see that there are 5 longevity switches, things that we have been doing for 5,000 years that actually support longevity, that longevity switch on for us. And those are, the first is to remove toxins. The second switch is to add prana or life force energy. The third switch is to move prana. The fourth is to sync with nature. And the fifth is to feed the system or nourish the mind, body, and soul. And I saw that because I saw similarities in many of the practices. I grouped them in the book according to those longevity switches, right? And the truth is, and people will realize this when they read the book, is that all of the practices in the book really will switch on all of the switches, to tell you the truth, right? So it's not like you can go wrong. Pretty much it's going to switch on but I try to sort of make it a little simpler and a little less overwhelming to say that if you are thinking that, the switch I need to switch on for my longevity is to remove toxins, I'm realizing that my toxic load is really, really high. I can go to that section in the book and look at some of the practices that are there and go for a quick win and start implementing something today that is going to help to start to decrease the toxic load that I'm experiencing and therefore increase my longevity.
So can you take us through briefly some of these 5 steps? So you just talked about the removal of toxins.
Sure.
And you have, like you said, you can go to that section in the book, but if you could give us a brief insight into each of these steps, it'd be great.
Sure. So the idea of removing toxins really is very simple. I mean, we talk about that a lot in Ayurveda, is how do we remove the toxic load? How do we get rid of amma, right? That's what we're really sort of thinking about. And so that's really where that idea came from, is that we need to decrease the amma that is in our bodies, in our minds and our souls. And then I'm going to go through all 5 of them and just sort of relate them to Ayurveda. And then I think maybe what would be more helpful is if I could tell your listeners, maybe 2 or 3 things that I really see as a starting point to help support longevity.
Perfect.
Is that okay? Okay.
That's perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. So removing toxins is really about this idea of decreasing the toxic load, of removing the amma. The second is adding prana, right? We know prana is a life force energy. And what are the biggest sources of prana that we have? It is the sun, the air, and the water, right? And so how do we start to add that prana into our system, right? That's so important for our health and our longevity. The third is really moving that prana, right? We know in Ayurveda that the entire energy system, which is the blueprint for the body, right? The chakras, the nadis, the marma points, right? That's all a system of energy. That is the blueprint for the physical body. And when we have blockages in that energy system, we will have issues, right? That will show up as symptoms, mild, subtle, or obvious and chronic, right? And so the idea is, how do we continually move that energy, that life force energy, that prana through the system? So that's the third longevity switch. The fourth is to sync with nature. We see this in the Ayurveda clock, right? That's the original circadian medicine, right? In 2017, the Nobel Prize for Medicine was given to a group of researchers who developed or who discovered the mechanisms of circadian rhythm, right? The circadian clock. Well, we've had that in Ayurveda for 5,000 years, in the Ayurvedic clock that tells us what to do when, right? Mm-hmm. How to live with the path of the sun through the sky. And so syncing with nature is really that longevity switch, because so many of the things that we do in Ayurveda are based on that clock, right? Living in harmony with nature, which is the essence of Ayurveda. And then the fifth longevity switch is to feed the system. And when I say system, I mean mind, body, spirit. How are we feeding ourselves, right? Because we know in Ayurveda that the food that we take in through our mouths is not the only food that we have, right? And our digestive fire is not only dealing with that physical food, it's actually our ability to digest everything that we come in contact with. It's sort of a metaphor, right? For our ability to take in what we need and keep it, and then get rid of what we don't, right? That's sort of the metaphor. And so that fifth switch is, how can we feed our system, our body, our mind, and spirit to increase our longevity? So that's how it relates.
Okay, beautiful. Thank you for that. And that, particularly that last point, I want to link on that a little bit, because a lot of times we get caught up in the food and the, the diet and the cleansing and so on. But we need to really think holistically, right? When it comes to longevity and health and well-being.
Right. And, and I just to one point to that is that, when I first set out to write this book and I outlined it and everything, I wasn't planning on going into sort of the spiritual realm. Only because that's a very personal thing for me. And I talk about it with my patients and students, but I've never really written about it. And by the time I was writing the last chapter and the last part of the last chapter, I knew that I had to, for this exact reason, because what I think I realized also during that healing journey of breast cancer is that the connection to the divine was such an important point, an important resource and healing tool for me in my journey, that I couldn't not write about it. Connection to others, connection to yourself, connection to the divine. It's so essential, right? Especially when we're thinking about, right now in the United States, anyway, there's, this epidemic of loneliness and, the effects of loneliness. And, there are studies that have been shown that people who have a self-reported sense of loneliness have the same effects as smoking a pack of cigarettes each day. That's the effect of that loneliness, that self-perceived sense of loneliness on their health. That is astounding.
It is.
Right? And so I think there was this understanding through so many of the lessons I learned for me personally, but also looking at it holistically, with respect to health and wellness, that piece for connection is absolutely essential for our health, our longevity, our wellness, our well-being. And so I had to include it. So
yeah, absolutely. And you make some great points there, like connection to ourselves, connection to community, and to connection your belief in something, whatever that is for you.
exactly. Exactly.
And
It's something larger than yourself, whatever that is.
Yeah, particularly when we're living in stressful times, or if we go through stressful times in our life, as you did, it's, being able to hand over those stressors, like you said, to something greater than ourselves can really bring about peace within us as well. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
And we shouldn't underestimate that finding whatever that is for you. And it can be many things for many people. It could be nature or anything. But making sure that you have that sense of belief in something and connecting to it.
Yes. I think it's essential. It's really essential.
And Dr. Avanti, as we finish up here, is there any other areas that you want to touch on that we didn't, or anything that you wanted to highlight?
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to really quickly tell you, your listeners, 3 things that I think that they can do right now to support their longevity.
Oh, okay? Fantastic. Great.
Really quickly. The first is to fast. Don't eat for 12 hours overnight. We know this in Ayurveda, right? When you're sleeping, when the sun is asleep, you're not supposed to be eating. Just make sure you really practice that. Why is that important? Because fasting is the biggest spark. It sort of ignites a process called autophagy in the body. Autophagy is how we clean up old junky cell parts and get rid of them so that they're not lying around and causing issues in our tissues and that inflammation that leads to physiological aging. So if you fast every night, what you're doing is you're resetting that autophagy every single day. So just don't eat for 12 hours overnight. Okay. And then if you can increase to 14 or 16 hours, wonderful, but at least 12 hours, no eating. You can have water or herbal tea, but nothing else. The second longevity practice that I would say that you could do is to make sure that you get outside into natural sunlight for at least 10 minutes. Better to do 20 minutes, but at least 10 minutes before 10 a.m. or as soon as you wake up. Again, you want to get that light into your eyes. So no sunglasses, not through a window, not through a car window. You're not looking at the sun, but you're just in natural daylight. The reason is that resets your circadian rhythm every single day. Circadian rhythm is so important because it has a downstream effect on every cell, system, organ in the body. It controls a cascade of hormones, of chemical messengers, et cetera, et cetera. So if you can restart and sort of set your circadian clock every day, you will support your longevity. So that's the second practice I'd ask everybody to do. And then the third is sort of a two-for. It's meditate and breathe. These are things that we talk a lot about in Ayurveda, right? And why is that? Because meditation and breath, we know, are so well studied that they can shift us from a sympathetic stressor response into a parasympathetic or relaxed response. Why is that important? Because we know that stress response, the cortisol that's, coursing through our veins all the time, that is one of the biggest links to inflammation, which then links to aging and, and early mortality and morbidity. And so if we can learn how to sort of modulate that using breath and using meditation, we can actually help to support our longevity. And so if you could start to even 3 minutes of meditation, just finding a point of focus, breath, extend your exhale longer than your inhale, that activates the parasympathetic nervous system, the vagus nerve. You are really doing a lot to support your longevity. So those are the 3 things I'd ask people to do.
I love that. Thank you. Yes. And we disregard the breath so easily. And it is the most effective, easiest, fastest way for us to regulate ourselves, right? Regulate our body and mind. So great.
Yes, absolutely.
And I love the fasting because Ayurveda was the initial intermittent fasting. That's great. Fasting, getting out in the sunlight first thing in the morning before 10 a.m. and meditation and breathing. Dr. Avanti, absolutely wonderful. I think this is such an important book. And now I'd love for you to tell people where they can find your new book, The Longevity Formula, and also more about you and your offerings.
Yeah,
Please.
absolutely. You can find everything on my website. It's my full name, avantikumar-singh.com. There'll be links there for my book to pre-order. That's open right now. You can pre-order the book on pretty much every retailer. If you just search Longevity Formula and my name. I'm on Instagram as Avanti Kumar-Singh. I'm there a lot and I love to hear questions. So, feel free to DM me and I'll do my best to answer you as quickly as I can. And then I have a podcast also, The Healing Catalyst. And I talk a lot about longevity, about all of these different subjects. So I would love for any of you to join me over there as well.
Well, fantastic. And I love that, there's a lot of discussion around longevity, as you said, in the past few years and a lot of research. But now that you're bringing this ancient wisdom of Ayurveda into the longevity discussion as well and highlighting it and, the understanding that this information is thousands of years old, time tested, as we said earlier, and is an important part for all of us to understand as we try to bring life into our years.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
Dr. Avanti, it's been a pleasure. Thank you again for sharing. I'm so happy to hear that you're doing well and healthy, and now you're putting out these wonderful books into the world. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Colette.
My pleasure.
Pleasure to be with you.
Take good care of yourself.
Thank you so much.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Dr. Avanti, and please check out the show notes for all the links mentioned. And if you would like support on your Ayurvedic journey, then please check out my online services. I'll put a link in the show notes or visit my website, elementshealingandwellbeing.com. And don't forget, you can join that Elements of Ayurveda podcast community there also. If you think that this episode will be helpful to family or friends, please share it with them so we can spread this wisdom of Ayurveda. And if you feel that you're getting benefit from this podcast, I would really appreciate a rating and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Don't forget to subscribe or follow the podcast so the new weekly episodes will download for you automatically. And come join me on social media. My new Instagram page is Elements of Ayurveda Podcast. And on Facebook, it's Elements Healing and Wellbeing. Thank you so much for tuning in. And until next time, take good care of yourself, be well, and bye for now. Slán go fóill.